Welcome to What's New, your guide to Arctic geopolitics, governance, and security. Today we will be talking about China in the Arctic, and we have an expert on China in the Arctic here today with us. We have Erdem Lamazhapov. You've been researching China in the Arctic for quite some time now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. And first of all, I want to ask you a question, and that is, what is the Arctic for China? Do they really prioritize the military interests in the region? Is it primarily economic? What do they really want?
The military interests have never been particularly big for China historically. For China, the main interests in the Arctic are scientific and commercial. So the thing that drove China's Arctic engagement at the end of the century was the fact that China was not part of the club of countries that were researching the Arctic. So in 1995, the first Chinese expedition, which was organized somewhat privately by the scientists at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, went to the North Pole, and they said, okay, this is the first time the Chinese people are at the North Pole. And then that's how China became part of the IASC, International Arctic Science Committee. And at the first IASC meeting, Chinese scientists felt that they didn't have much right to speak at the Arctic affairs because China officially has never launched an Arctic expedition before. So what happened is that they sent through the ministry, the Chinese Arctic and Antarctic Administration, they sent a letter to the State Council. And the State Council read this letter and they said, yes, there is a need to organize China's first Arctic expedition. So in 1999, Xuelong, which is China's first research icebreaker, went to the Arctic. And since then, China has had a constant scientific research presence in the Arctic. The second interest is, of course, the commercial interest. And for China, there are several things that have been interesting in the Arctic. Obviously, the main of them is the use of the shipping routes, the Northern Sea route or the Northeast Passage. And so China has been using the Northern Sea route in some capacity, which is not a lot, but the anticipation is there. There will be a lot more Chinese shipping on the Northern Sea route. And in order for that to happen, the basic developments have to already start now. So that's why China has been active in shipping as well. Even though right now it doesn't look like there is a lot of commercial opportunities for transit shipping. What we have seen is that there's been a lot of destination shipping. So commodities that are produced in the Arctic, in particular in the Russian Arctic, that are being transported out of it to the West and also to China as one of the destinations. On the military side, in the China's national security law, the polar regions are mentioned that it's one of the areas of the comprehensive national security that Xi Jinping has developed. So there is some understanding that the polar regions are important for China's security. But the Ministry of State Security has released a sort of explanation on what they mean by the polar security. And there the emphasis is very much on the security of China's stations, icebreakers in the polar regions. So sort of these things, which it could be that it's just one of the aspects. But I don't think there is any concrete military interests in the Arctic yet. There is definitely no constant presence. It may happen in the future.
Speaking of going back to the commercial part, you mentioned shipping, and there was recently this huge hype about the Istanbul Bridge crossing over from China to the UK over the Northern Sea route and Northeast Passage. And my question to you then is, will we see many more shipments like these? Will they in any way affect international shipping?
Well, I don't think it's a one-off thing. Obviously, this is a sign that there is still a lot of commercial interest in pursuing this route. And yes, I think there is a lot of opportunity to develop this route. But then again, it's the question of scale. Even when we imagine in 50, 60 years, when this route will be commercially used, it probably will be a stream compared to the enormous rivers that are flowing through the traditional channels, right? through the Suez Canal and around the Horn of Africa. Yes, I think it will be definitely a big and constant presence in the future of the Arctic. Well, it will be exactly as big as people have anticipated, which is not that big.
But how interested is China in this? I mean, we've been hearing about the Polar Silk Road. We'll have heard about all of these ambitions, and now you mentioned something of a scale which is much less than what these ambitions have said. What is happening?
Yeah, indeed, the scale is not as high as the anticipations that have been there. The Polar Silk Road is a very interesting case because it was a project that was proposed sort of jointly by Russia and China, but both sides deny that it's their initiative to have developed the Polar Silk Road. I mean, the Chinese sources usually say that it was Russia's initiative. Russian sources say that it's a Chinese initiative. And that means that the project was really, from the beginning, a sort of an effort where Russia was really interested in getting Chinese investment in the Russian Arctic to develop, among other things, the Northern Sea route. Whereas for China, it was really, from the beginning, a project to connect China to the European markets. And of course, Russia was a small part of it, but was not the main part of it. The Polar Silk Road goes through Russia to the European markets. At least this is how it was envisioned by the NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, and the 2017 white paper on the Maritime Silk Road. Yes, so the project was announced after a lot of back and forth, where Russia was initially very skeptical about the Belt and Road Initiative because it saw it as a sort of incursion of China into Russia's sphere of influence, primarily into the Central Asia. Xi Jinping actually announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 when he was on a visit to Kazakhstan. So the Belt and Road Initiative has always been this sort of Eurasian or Central Asian phenomenon at the start. When these disagreements have been sorted out, that's when the Polar Silk Road came. But then we haven't seen that many projects out of it. And then the United States has designated the Polar Silk Road as one of the sort of problems because I think in many strategies and congressional hearings, the Polar Silk Road has been problematized as one of the Chinese sort of incursions into the Arctic, which the United States has to scale back. And so that's how the Polar Silk Road became not that popular in Europe. And after that, it sort of started fizzling out. So now we don't actually see that many people in China using the Polar Silk Road, at least not the officials or commercial interests. It may come back at some point. I mean, the logic, the underlying logic, of course, is still there, that China needs to connect itself to the European market. That's why there was this ship. But the exact formulation is not used much anymore, and I don't think it will come back.
Speaking of buzzwords that have maybe died down a little bit, I'm thinking about the near Arctic state backstory, because every time, I think for you too, this is every time that you're at a Arctic or non-Arctic conference, you may hear the China calling themselves a near Arctic state as part of the narrative that people have about China, which is understandable. It's a bombastic thing to say. But can you dissect this a little bit for me? Do they really view themselves as this great near Arctic state, as an Arctic stakeholder? What is happening?
Yes, the near Arctic state identity is very interesting. Really been developed as sort of this counter identity to the division of states into Arctic and non-Arctic states. It's actually a term that was initially used by scholars, by academics, that said, okay, we see that the Arctic states are trying to push the narrative that there are only Arctic and non-Arctic states. And China can sort of subvert this by proposing this near Arctic state term, which from the beginning did not include just China. It was obviously meant as sort of this group of other countries that are also stakeholders. This is another term that China uses, stakeholders in the Arctic affairs. Like, for example, the United Kingdom, which calls itself the Arctic's nearest neighbor. So these countries, according to these scholars, were near Arctic states. So this is a term that two scholars in particular, Zhang Xia and Lu Junyuan, they developed further. And then it was brought before the foreign ministry when They were drafting the white paper, China's white paper on the Arctic affairs and on China's Arctic policy. So that's how the term sort of entered the official parlance. It was accepted by the officials, and they started using it as well in international contexts, and then it was codified in the China's Arctic policy white paper in 2018. The reaction to this term was immediately negative. Mike Pompeo's speech in 2019, he said that there are no near-Arctic states. There are only two types of states, right? Arctic states and non-Arctic states. In some way, it does appear that this term was sort of a faux pas on part of China. They should probably not have used this term. Obviously, it's been received negatively. Actually, these days, China has really scaled back on the use of the term. It's not much seen in official diplomatic speech. There are still scholars that use it. But this was sort of supposed to be China's new Arctic identity, so that China will always stay to be interested in the Arctic affairs.
You know, this reminds me of like when you're in high school and you wear like a weird hat because you want this to be your new identity, and then it's kind of embarrassing, you remove it, and then you're forever the hat guy. Like, this is what's happened with China with the non-Arctic state. They're forever the hat guy. Can't avoid it. Are there any myths or misconceptions that you can see academics, policymakers have about China's role in the Arctic?
Well, there have been a lot of misconceptions about China's role in the Arctic, obviously. The last one was aired not too long ago when we heard that there are a lot of Russian and Chinese ships off the coast of Canada. It doesn't appear to me that there are a lot of Russian and Chinese ships. Obviously, there is some intelligence data which we as academics don't have access to. I have seen the new Danish, for example, report about threats to Denmark. It says that China is interested in deploying submarines in the Arctic region. I don't know anything about submarines. I have no access to any documents that talk about submarines. Maybe. I'm sort of skeptical, but if the intelligence services say so, they probably have a good reason to say that. That I'll leave sort of aside. When it comes to other misconceptions, I mean, there's been recently a very good report written by Anders Edström, Gudbjörg Ricki Haugsdotter, and Whitney Lackenbauer that talked about Chinese investment in the Arctic. And there was talk about this, that China is investing a lot in the Arctic. And then they actually went and looked at what China actually has invested in and what has gone through. Well, I mean, it is there. It's just a little bit more modest than what people have portrayed it as. So there are definitely still quite a lot of misconceptions, because usually when people talk about China in the Arctic, it's always on this high sort of abstract level. China is investing a lot, China is shipping a lot, China is doing this and that. And when you actually look at what's happening on the ground, it's much more modest than what the high-level abstraction would make you believe. A lot of people think that China was interested in the Arctic primarily because of their material interest, right? Like military interest that you've already mentioned, or resource extraction was also a big one. That's not completely out of touch, because, I mean, the reason why China has become interested in the Arctic in the first place was because of the talk of the US Geological Survey report on the petroleum resources in the Arctic. There is a kernel of truth to that, but I argue that the main structural driver behind China's engagement was status seeking, that China has always looked at itself as a great power, and suddenly it found that in order to be a great power, you have at least maintain some sort of interests in the Arctic region, because all of other great powers are there. Even Japan is there, and Japan is China does not see Japan on the same level as itself, but as an important regional rival. So when China saw that Japan is interested in the Arctic, or India is interested in the Arctic, there was obviously some sort of status competition there. So this is one of the under-researched areas of China's engagement. And even in the military exercises that China has had with Russia, there are a lot of different reasons why China needs to have joint military exercises with Russia. But one of the things that China wished to signal to the United States in the Bering Sea is that, well, if you can poke us in the South China Sea, then we can also go and do the same in the around Alaska. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but this, status and great power ambition was the thing that was structuring the engagement, even when we found out that actually, okay, there aren't that many petroleum resources that are super commercially interesting, like offshore oil, right? Because the oil prices have fallen, and still China is in the Arctic. I mean, in 2018, when China's white paper came out, there has already been no hype about petroleum resources, and yet the white paper did come out. So it's not just material resources or material interests, it's also status as a great power.
Game.
Yeah,
it's the love for the game. I think my last question to you is one thing that we haven't covered yet, that I really want to ask you about, which is also mentioned quite frequently, I think, and more after 22. And that is not only the role of science, but the role of a very specific thing in science, and that is this, you could say, infamous term dual use. China has been, there has been some work created by certain areas in academia, at least in Arctic studies, about the use of scientific data for dual purposes, military and civilian, and also the existence of research stations as well. That has been raised as like this point. So what do you, as somebody who looks at China and analyzes China daily, what is your take on this interpretation, on these, you could say, dual use worries?
The dual use is really a very ambiguous term in a way, because it does speak to something that is really a legitimate concern, right? That science is used for military purposes, and that is probably happening with all of the great powers. So I guess the greatest admission of guilt is to accuse someone of that. I don't know whether Chinese scientists cooperate very closely with the People's Liberation Army. My take would be that probably they do, and it probably ends up in the military circles. But how useful is it actually? I don't know that either. Is that actually that useful? So this entire dual use debate, it seems to me that there should be some sort of understanding between all of the scientific actors in the Arctic region about what kind of data are they collecting, how are they going to share this data. So the transparency is obviously an easy answer to the question of dual use. But then again, there is an old joke that a shovel is a dual use weapon, because it can be used as a shovel and it can also be used as a weapon. So yes, it's probably happening, and I wouldn't be too worried about it. I'm more worried about keeping science cooperation going. I think that is a much more important priority. But, well, I'm not a military expert, so who knows?
I've been thinking about this too, because there are so many of these kinds of terms that have been flying around, especially the past, you could say, actually 5 years, to be honest, that have been somehow referring to a certain type of threat, but they're vague. They do not pinpoint the direct threat. They do not talk about the direct effects. And then it's like, you could see where each academic is coming from when they address the questions. I'm a very big fan of what you said, knowing what's at stake and how useful is it really. And that's the thing about many things in the Arctic. Many things are a bit more boring than we want them to be. They're a little less bombastic. But when we look at the future of China's engagement in the Arctic, there's a lot of restrictions, of course. The last thing you mentioned is the scientific cooperation. That's also, a challenge to maintain after 2022. So what's your take on the future engagement of China in the Arctic?
That's an easy question. I don't know what's going to happen.
But I'm trying to see the trends, because, scientists, we are good at seeing drivers, conditions, and based on these drivers, we can see some patterns. And which patterns can you see for the future to be somehow indicating?
I think there is a definite trend towards more great power competition, and that does not necessarily mean competition in the normal sense, sort of with weapons and stuff, but just competition in terms of technology, in terms of status. So China will definitely continue its polar effort. This does not only concern the Arctic, obviously, but also the Antarctica. And so I don't think that will go away because, well, science is important, not just for military, not just for climate studies. It's also important for technological progress. It's also important because people think that science is important. So that is, I think, definitely a very solid basis for Chinese future engagement in the Arctic. There will be also commercial interests. I mean, despite the fact that there are so many problems, I see that there is still interest in commercial engagement. So that is also not going away, probably. The things that are more difficult to predict are how the relations between the great powers will look like. What is Russia-China relationship going to be like in 50 years when the current leaders, Putin and Xi Jinping, will be long dead? So what is going to happen then? Who is going to come in their stead, and what kind of relationship are they going to develop? Russia and China obviously have a definite interest in keeping relationship cordial in any case, because they share a very long border that is important to... Russia would not have been able to wage war in Ukraine if the relationship with China was bad, because it would have needed to also man the border with China. So that is a definite interest that China and Russia have in keeping their relationship cordial. But historically, they have also been at the brink of war. So that can happen again easily. It's really difficult to predict because it can go both ways. But the trends that I've just outlined, that there will be more status competition between great powers, there will be more technological competition, and that the commercial interests will not go away. I think that is definitely there. I mean, climate change, when will the Arctic have its first ice-free event? We don't know yet, but it will happen at some point.
And one piece of advice for Western policymakers, if they had to implement it, what you say right now, it's the law, let's pretend that, about China in the Arctic, what would you say?
I think I would probably take advice from Deng Xiaoping, who allegedly formulated this foreign policy slogans for China. And one of them was 冷静观察, which is observe calmly, and the other one was keeping low profile. So calmly observe, don't rush to conclusions, and take action when it's needed. Because I'm not sure if the fast, big statements about stuff which may or may not be there helps anyone. Maybe take it easy, but act decisively when it's needed.
It's a great piece of advice. I think I even need the piece of advice for my own life. It's amazing and motivational as well. No, but thank you so much, Erdem. It's been great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to What's New. This podcast is supported by the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Arctic Institute. Follow for more on Arctic geopolitics.